Tuesday, March 3rd. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, we take the global temperature and sift through the events of the weekend and week thus far. The focus, of course, U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, and the fallout from that. What does it mean for the region, the world, and us here in our little corner of it? I'm just on the CBC News main page there, cbc.ca/news. Israel launches fresh wave of attacks on Iran and Lebanon as Iranian drones hit U.S. embassy in Saudi Arabia. Wall Street, global markets slammed with sell-off as war with Iran broadens. Iran has been cut off by internet blackouts. Those leaving give a glimpse of the reality on the ground. A diminished Iran would redraw the Middle East, and more. Oh, and also a story about a killer whale. Okay, so this is what we have right now on the CBC main page. Joining me here in the studio, Luke Ashworth is back, same with Justin Fantuozzo. So Lucian Ashworth, obviously poli-sci prof, purveyor of fine international relations. I think that's the tag I use for you. Justin Fantuozzo, history prof, expert on the modern Middle East.
Not killer whales.
Not killer whales, no. So you can't, and that story, it's killer whale moms struggle to regain body fat with more offspring is the story. So tucked below everything else that's going on, but still
no comment. No comment.
Yeah. Different show with different guests for a different time. So for everyone listening, for today, the guys are back. We do these kind of like state of the world kind of look at taking the temperature shows. We've got a couple of calls to make. We're going to call a prof at Osgoode Hall for the international law look at the attacks on Iran. We will talk with someone from the Iranian diaspora here who's been on the show before. And also, we're going to phone a Newfoundlander in Qatar just to see how she is doing. If you have thoughts for us, give us a text. 709-327-8206. Send us an email, thesignal@cbc.ca. And we'll start the chat, and then we can, if you want to join us with a call, I'll put up the numbers as well. But we'll get things going first. I always start these with what are you following? And I mean, there's just so much, but who wants to go first?
Sure, I don't mind going. I mean, it is interesting that if it wasn't for the weekend, we'd probably be talking about the Pakistani-Afghan war today.
Really, though? Because it was like,
that's serious.
Wow, yeah. But here we are.
But it is kind of being overshadowed. I actually, kind of completely differently is, again, we're going to be discussing conflict in Western Asia and the Middle East. But some really big news here that I have been following is the Gorton and Denton by-election in the UK and major Green win. But this on top of other developments within the UK, we're seeing the complete meltdown of the two-party system. This is, a parliamentary system, just like Canada. Canada still maintained, in fact, has strengthened that two-party system. But what's happening in the UK, in UK politics, and the kind of restructuring of the politics on both the right and the left is actually really kind of fascinating. And no one's getting hit by missiles or killed.
Yeah, so that, right, exactly. So for everything going on, there's also this part which we could be paying attention to and watching. Justin, what about yourself?
I mean, my focus is squarely on Iran and increasingly on Lebanon as well, on the Gulf states, trying to understand and certainly not predict, but envision the ways in which Iran might choose to escalate and retaliate in this conflict as they've been doing by striking American military bases throughout the Gulf states, as well as civilian infrastructure in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Oman, in Bahrain, but also the situation as it's unfolding on Israel's northern border and in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, which started firing rockets into northern Israel again on Sunday night. And now overnight, yesterday, has led to an Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon yet again. That's the first time that they've penetrated into southern Lebanon since the ceasefire in late 24.
What's as we watch this, it keeps moving along, the potential for things to get catastrophically worse? Like where, as you lick your finger and stick it into the air.
Yeah.
Where are you with just what are you watching for?
Well, I mean, I'll quote Aaron David Miller from a few years ago. He was referring to the very early days of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza in late 2023. But I mean, it's likely to get worse before it gets worse. It's probably going to get worse. We've had every indication from the Americans and from the Israelis that this is not a 48, 72, 96 hour kind of thing. This is going to be probably at least through the end of this week, if not longer. We might be talking weeks or months of military strikes and action in Iran, or indeed if the Iranians choose to escalate this by engaging their proxies elsewhere. We might talk about, again, a kind of wider conflict, similar to the way that we talked about the war between Israel and Hamas expanding, right, in 2023 and into 2024. It's interesting because we were just chatting briefly before the show began, actually, about this idea of escalation dominance and who kind of controls the pace at which escalation happens in this conflict. Now, it's very clear that the Americans and the Israelis have probably that position. Yeah. Right? They probably have escalation dominance here. They have complete air superiority over the skies of Tehran. They obviously have operatives on the ground, fleshing out the locations of the targets that they've been attacking, tracking their movements. We've seen various reports of that in the media since at least last June, since the 12-day war last June. So there's certainly escalation dominance on the side of the Americans and the Israelis. They can choose where, when, and how they want to escalate things because of the superiority that they have in the air. But what we still have to pay attention to is what is the Iranian retaliatory strategy here? Yeah. Is it a slow unfolding of retaliatory strikes? Is this going to be a gradual attempt to kind of draw out the conflict and suck the Americans in again and the Israelis into a wider war? One of the main questions that I've seen as well is how many ballistic missiles and or drones do the Iranians really have? And will they over time exhaust the supply of interceptor missiles that the Americans and the Israelis and their Gulf state allies need to shoot these things down? Yeah. Right? And those interceptor missiles are also very expensive. $500,000, $1 million per interceptor. Some of the drones that the Iranians use, particularly a kamikaze drone known as the Shahed 136, which the Russians use in Ukraine as well. The Americans actually had to retroactively engineer from an Iranian model. Theirs is called the Lucas, and they're using it in this conflict. Those are very cheap. Those are $10,000, $20,000 a pop. So there's an economic supply logistics side to this as well, that every time the Americans have to use their high-altitude air defense system, their THAAD system, to shoot down these...
Massively expensive.
Massively expensive. Like I said, $500,000, $1 million or so per interceptor missile that's fired. The other side of the scale is it's firing at a $10,000, $20,000 projectile, right? Like the math doesn't add up there. And what we'll really need to pay attention to is how many of these strikes can the Iranians actually launch at Israel and the Gulf states.
Because one of the statements from Donald Trump kind of was like, this is your one chance for generations, Iranian population. So rise up, da-da-da-da-da. But the complexity of, granted, the decapitation of the leadership happened, but there's different levels of it. After this thing goes on for a couple of weeks, if regime change isn't there, then what? Is it a boots on the – because the whole thing, Donald Trump ran on saying, I'm the peace president. And the big joke lately for his board of peace is what's the spelling on that? Is it B-O-R-E-D or is it B-O-A-R-D? What are you guys thinking about just the risk factor there? For everything you just laid out, Justin, what do you think?
Well, I mean, this is one person writing in The Guardian who kind of writes sort of semi-humorous pieces pointed out that Donald Trump had failed to get the Peace Prize, so now he's going for the Nobel War.
Yeah, he got the
FIFA one. Yeah, that's right, inaugural.
Let's not
FIFA
forget.
One. But he's now going for the Nobel War Prize. But I think there's just going on from what Justin has said as well is we are seeing this escalation, and of course. One of the aspects of this escalation is with Gaza as well. The return of the issue of Gaza, with the closing off of the crossings, and now we're looking at a potential humanitarian tragedy again in Gaza. So this is kind of spreading its tentacles around. I mean, the other thing I think on this one as well is the question of the response from the global south outside of the region, because obviously regional actors are having very different views. There's a lot of very anti-Iranian views, particularly in the Gulf and so forth. But the reaction from the global south has been interesting. Sifamandla Zondi, who's a professor of politics at the University of Johannesburg, was kind of summarized a lot of global south reactions to this, that seeing the West as seeing wars as having moral purpose. Meanwhile, we in the global south see it as an evil and a failure of being an adult. Yeah. So this kind of vision now of the West under Donald Trump and this new kind of Western alliance under Trump being a kind of infantile, fundamentalist warmonger. Now, you can argue with that view, and you can argue against the view that also global south leaders are necessarily overtly peaceful. But it is showing a kind of a shift in global south attitudes, or rather a continuation of a much longer trend that is becoming a lot more anti-Western and a lot more resistant to kind of claims by the West of kind of moral superiority.
I think the idea that regime change is going to happen in a matter of days or weeks is certainly not impossible. We saw in the case of Syria in 2024 and into 25 how quickly a regime that was built on a legacy of oppression and surveillance and a security state. We saw how quickly that kind of regime could fall when the Assad regime fell in Assad. Or sorry, when the Assad regime fell in Damascus. Sorry. So it's not impossible that these things can move much, much faster than we think they can. Obviously, the main difference in a place like Syria from the time that its civil war started in 2013 or so up until the fall of the Assad regime was that you already had elements within the state security apparatus and the military that had turned on the regime. Right? You had a viable, despite what you might think or say about their ideological leanings or their own kind of radical ideologies in the case of Ahmed al-Shara, the new president of Syria, and his former links with the Islamic State. You had a viable alternative and one that could actually wrest power from the state security apparatus, which, as we know, was propped up by fighters from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, from IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers. Like, it was a very multifaceted system in Syria. The difference that we have right now in Iran is that you still have the issue of 1 million or so men who form the ranks of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC's militia, the Basiji, and all of the other kind of security and intelligence apparati of the state. And how exactly you're going to remove that apparatus without there being some kind of opposition force akin to a free Syrian army that was largely the main military player in Syria, but the Kurds as well and others. I don't know how that's going to happen, and it's certainly not going to happen in days or weeks. We're talking months or maybe even years before you can transition to something out of the Islamic regime.
I'm thinking as well that, Justin, a really good comparison here as well is Libya. Here again, Obama went in for these airstrikes. And in fact, that's really when the US started to use airstrikes in the way that it's doing now again. But the crucial thing there, it was intervening in a civil war, and there were recognizable targets on the ground and recognizable allies on the ground who could exploit that. That's not the situation here. And in fact, the problem is here, we seem to be seeing a strategy without a goal. And I think it was one of those rare times when Keir Starmer really kind of, the British Prime Minister has a really good quotable line. He was talking about you can't do regime change from the skies. And this is a fundamental problem with the strategy of the Trump administration at the moment.
Going back to the 1990s and the NATO airstrikes against Serbia during the Kosovo War. I mean, again, there were definable allies on the ground. The West and the United States were clearly aligning themselves with Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time, and the Croatians in that conflict in the 1990s against the Serbs. But Luke is right. I mean, and Starmer's oddly and unusually prescient there. We don't have many historical examples, certainly not in the latter half of the 20th century, when air powers become really maybe the defining characteristic of military operations.
In fact, we have the opposite. I'm thinking here of North Vietnam and Operation Linebacker and things like that.
I mean, even though we overuse them, even allusions to the Second World War, there's never been any clear consensus on the degree to which Allied bombings of Germany hastened the end of Nazi Germany. Right? There's never been any clear consensus that the degree to which the Americans bombed the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War actually led to the fall of the regime. So, airstrikes can only go so far if there's no opposition force on the ground that's willing to step in and push the
facilitation.
Facilitate and push the security apparatus.
Let's go. We've got, I put a call out, we emailed and got in touch with Professor Heidi Matthews yesterday, law professor at Osgoode Hall. Professor Matthews, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
As we were talking at the start of the show here, we got someone called and left a message saying, what's the good of the UN these days? What is their role if they can't stop these wars? And I think this folds into why I wanted to talk to you. Like when we look at international law, the legality of or the lack of it, of these types of attacks. I'm just wondering your thoughts on what's unfolded since Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, I can provide what is actually a really simple international law analysis, and then maybe comment a little bit on the Canadian reaction. I mean, people like to critique international legal institutions that were established in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, which I heard you just talking about now. In main part, in fact, to actually renounce the resolution of international disputes through the use of force. And so the idea very clearly with the UN Charter system established 80 years ago, right, was to say we no longer go to war when we have a political disagreement, no matter who that's with, right? The UN Charter system is not perfect. It's very, very far from perfect. In large part, that's because of the permanent five system, which means that allied powers, mostly allied powers and obviously global hegemons, at that time basically have a veto at the Security Council. So it's not a perfect system. It doesn't prevent lots of wars, and it actually historically has given the green light to all kinds of conflicts that have had very negative impacts. But the fact of the matter is, the UN as a system, right, is nothing more nor less than the configuration of states that make it up, right? So states use the United Nations framework, right, use international legal institutions and frameworks in order to make their political designs known and to sort things out without resorting to the use of force. And so rather than targeting the institutions as such, we need to look at the politics that is being fed into them, right? We need to look at what states are actually doing when they interact or choose not to interact with those systems. And this is what is so concerning to me about the Canadian response to what is very clearly an American-Israeli aggression on Iran, and we could talk about that from a legal perspective. But starting backwards, what is so concerning about the Canadian response, which basically was Carney came out of the gates on Saturday almost immediately saying, we support these strikes on Iran, right? There's been a little bit of walking back with Anita Anand on that, but nothing actually condemning the aggression. All of that flies in the face of everything that Carney said in his speech at Davos that got everybody so excited about Canada somehow, regaining a sense of itself and a sense of capacity to exert its sovereignty on the international stage. So at Davos, Carney reiterated his commitment to the UN Charter, right? Specifically, in his words, our principled commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition on the use of force, except when consistent with the UN Charter. To support what is obviously, as a matter of consensus in the international legal community, an aggressive war, is plainly inconsistent with everything he said at Davos. And, I mean, to be very frank about it, puts Canadian sovereignty at serious risk.
I was looking on, I don't go on X very often anymore, but when I have guests come on, I check out to see if they've said anything. And you put out one, an X, I guess, this morning about viewing images. Can you talk about just that tweet?
Yeah, sure. Part of what is so disturbing with the Canadian reaction is also what has not been said. Okay, so in addition to supporting overtly, providing moral support, which is a very serious matter, to an act of aggression, what the Canadian government has done is remained completely silent on an attack that happened very soon in this conflict on a girls' primary school in southern Iran. It's killed over 150 people, many of those little girls, and injured nearly 100 more. And I just tweeted this morning, reading the news as I do each morning about, viewing the graves being dug for those little girls after having just dropped off my own little girl to her school bus here in St. John's, right? And that's a really dystopian experience to have as a law professor, but everybody on the street should be having this experience when our political leaders are not only supporting the aggression, but failing to say anything about this attack at all. And so while we have Anita Anand coming out and deploring, rightly, any attacks by Iran that has indiscriminately targeted or impacted civilian objects, she's right to condemn that. She hasn't said anything about this attack with respect to the school. And what we do know, obviously, information still coming in, but there's very serious reason to believe that attack took place because of the use of artificial intelligence in targeting practices. The reason the U.S. military is doing that now, and the reason that Israel has been doing it for years in Gaza, is because it quote, shortens the kill chain. That's the idea, right? In other words, it makes target identification faster, and it relieves the legal responsibility on those who are making targeting decisions to actually verify that their targets are legitimate targets, i.e. that they aren't little girls at school.
What else are you watching for now as the days progress? Like what, and I'd ask what you'd like to see, but just in general, like what is it, the steps now that you're watching for and paying attention acutely to in the days coming?
Well, look, it's always open to states and their leaders to change their direction, right? So, it's open to Carney to say, look, maybe I spoke a little bit too fast and we're going to walk this back a bit in a serious way, which would actually involve condemning the unlawful use of force in the first place. And the reason I'm calling this war an aggressive war, and by the way, the main charge at the Nuremberg tribunals was that Nazi Germany had engaged in aggressive war across Europe and other parts of the world, okay? The reason why this is an aggressive war, per basic international law 101, very basic, very simple stuff that Carney and Anita Anand, as a former law professor, are well aware of, is that force can only be used under two circumstances, right, in the UN framework. One is if that force is approved by the United Nations Security Council. There was no attempt even to obtain Security Council authorization in this case, or if that force is used in self-defense. There is no credible argument for self-defense in this case. In order for an attack to be in self-defense, it means that it's either responding to an attack that has already taken place on a state's territory or preventing an armed attack that is imminent and necessary. And imminence here does not mean some vague idea about preventing or deterring, the future acquisition of a nuclear weapon by Iran, et cetera. That's not imminence. That's entirely outside of the self-defense discussion. And it behooves the government, if they're serious, if Carney is serious about what he said at Davos, to revisit his position and recommit Canada fully to the peaceful resolution of disputes rather than open-ended moral support for aggression.
Professor Heidi Matthews, as always, thank you so much for your time and analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Heidi Matthews there, a law professor, Osgoode Hall from Newfoundland. One of the reasons why we give her a shout from time to time. Here's another note here. The Dow TSX are down over 1,000 points. It will be interesting with oil prices. I expect to see gas, diesel, furnace oil to take a good hike. That's from Gary, listener of the show. The Straits of Hormuz are closed, right?
Yep. Effectively.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, we've just come through we're living through a cost of living crisis. We've got inflation. We'll feel it at the pumps for oil for those of us who still don't have electric, which is an awful lot of us. What are your thoughts on just like what this could mean?
And on top of that, a lot of fertilizer comes through that way too. I mean, so there's all sorts of knock-ons effects in terms of prices on food, and of course, fossil fuel prices often link into other areas because they're used for power. I mean, this is a serious issue in terms of destabilization. This is a very important area. I think it's all about 40% of the world's oil and gas coming through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
Then on top of that, the drone attacks on the infrastructure there. So I think these are all good. I mean, and also just on that as well is backing up Heidi on that as well is the extent to which this is also a bad precedent. It's you can't just go around attacking a regime because you don't like it, and this is actually. We've seen that in reactions from Latin America, and again, we've talked about this on the show before, is that quite often when people from Latin America look at these various actions by the Trump administration, they are thinking back to the bad old days of the early and mid-20th century when the United States regularly intervened in Latin America using gunboat diplomacy force to force regime change, to force countries in Latin America. And of course, the big concern here is what precedent this has for Cuba.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I was talking to someone yesterday, a friend of mine. Just text back and forth with everything going on in the world, and I was just kind of like, if in Cuba, if you're with the regime there, you must be feeling awfully already nervous because of the embargo and fuel not getting and everything else. But watching this, like after what we already saw with Venezuela and now this here, I mean, it's because the U.S. president seems to be going through with a lot of the things he's been saying and thinking about for a while. He seems to be now following through. We've got two other folks to get to on the line, but first I want to go back to you, Justin. Just any thoughts of what Luke was saying there, inflation, or anything that Professor Matthews said earlier?
Well, I think there's two things perhaps to point out in relation to the discussion about the United Nations and the role they play or don't play in stopping conflicts or ameliorating them. This is something we often talked about when there were similar outcries about a lack of UN action in regards to Gaza and the Israeli war there against Hamas and Islamic Jihad. There is, I think, again, a fundamental misunderstanding, and I think Heidi kind of implied that. There's to me often a fundamental misunderstanding of the role that the United Nations is meant to play in international politics. Again, it is not a peacemaking organization. Its directive, its role has never been to unilaterally intervene in conflicts and enforce peace. Right? I mean, in fact, the whole peacekeeping structure, as many people know, is predicated on an invitation from a host state. I mean, you have to be invited into the region to send a UN peacekeeping force. I think some of what's getting lost in the discussion about the United Nations as well, and I'm not a legal expert, so I obviously defer to Heidi on the issues of international law and legality. In 2005 as well, though, the United Nations General Assembly endorsed the responsibility to protect, i.e. known in shorthand as R2P. Now, that did not imply the use of military intervention to protect, but the goal of R2P was to encourage the international community to intervene either in genocide, human rights violations, war crimes, etc. And really, the kind of implicit part of the policy was that the strong have a responsibility to protect the weak. At least 7,000 Iranians killed in January in street protests, protesting the declining economy there, the political repression. Some numbers have placed the death toll at as high as 30,000. Who knows? I wonder where R2P and the idea of it fits into all of this. Now, it's certainly not the main motivation of the Trump administration. We've heard everything from curtailing Iran's nuclear ambitions, which are clearly there. And that's a separate debate about whether or not we think Iran should be able to pursue a nuclear program.
And after June, when they said it was completely annihilated with the program anyways, with the...
That's right. Although, as we were talking a bit earlier as well, the concern here also has been on the expansion of their intercontinental ballistic missile program. And there's a couple of other things behind the scenes that it's been harder to pay attention to. Iran last year signed a 25-year, $400 billion deal with China for China to invest in the Iranian economy, which effectively props up the regime economically. They also signed a major defense pact with Russia for Russia to sell them billions of dollars worth of shoulder-fired air missile defense units, which again makes the opportunity to intervene in Iran and rightfully or wrongfully try to engineer regime change more difficult. The kinds of airstrikes we're seeing now would be much more difficult to carry out if there were tens of thousands of shoulder-propelled anti-aircraft weapons in the hands of IRGC and Iranian military forces. So there's been a lot of things going on behind the scenes over the last 2 to 3 years that I think have contributed to this decision and have really, along with, I would argue, profoundly stupid Iranian decision-making at the governmental level that have led to the situation we find ourselves in. Let
me go to the phones. We've got 2 guests I want to get to, then we'll go back to the folks here in studio. Aysan Darvishi is back on the line. Aysan, how are you doing?
Hi, Adam. I'm good. How are you?
Good. So you were a guest not too long ago on the show because we were talking about diaspora populations, folks in a time of upheaval back home. You're here. You're originally from Iran. I'm just wondering how you're doing, and just what you're watching with back home.
So thanks for asking. So as of now, I am worried, and actually I'm hopeful at the same time. I don't have any means of communication with my family as the Islamic regime cut off all the communications since the start of the war. Last time I talked to them was before the war started, and despite being worried, actually their spirits were high and while waiting for rescue from the world. So I just want to mention something before we get to the next question. I am kind of disappointed in people who don't have any idea about what's going on inside Iran, like politically talking about it and blaming U.S. and Israel on attacking on Iran. Guys, this is a hostage rescue situation.
Right. Yeah, and when you were on last time we talked, and you were hoping for U.S. intervention because you were talking about, the people in the streets and the response of violence that they were met with, and the deaths and the hope for, like you said, a rescue. So so as you follow. All right, with the top of the leadership gone, waiting to hear what comes next, what are you watching for and hopeful for in the days and weeks that are coming for your home country?
I can only echo what people in Iran are saying and hoping for. And the videos coming out of Iran actually are very interesting. People are cheering when the missiles hit the Islamic Republic target. And they are, of course, afraid. War is not good. Everybody knows that. But they are hopeful. And what we are hoping to see is the remaining regime officials come to this understanding that they need to surrender to people's will and end this madness, start transitioning of power to who people see as their representative, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. It is unlikely because they are ruthless criminals, but if they want to end the war, this is what needs to happen. And this is going to happen one way or another, and we are hoping for Iran that is finally a normal country, free, secular democracy, friendly towards the world, and acts in best interest of its people and the world's peace.
Aysan, I know you're working. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, and it's good to check in with you. And we'll stay in touch. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good day.
Oh, you too. Okay, so that's some of the one opinion from the someone in the Iranian diaspora in St. John's, part of the Newfoundland and Labrador community. Before I go back to my guests here, Allison Furlong is on the line in Doha, Qatar. Allison, how you doing?
Hi, doing well, Adam.
Hey, loud and clear. All right, hold on. Let me. I also have you on video on my screen, so I can actually see you, which is great. How are things? Walk me through from the weekend to now for what you folks have been going through living in Doha.
Sure. Well, today is day 4 for those of us who have been, I guess, on the ground here. The first couple of days were, I guess, a bit of a blur, really. We were hearing a lot of missile interception overhead, basically almost on the hour. So that was, terrifying, I guess, in its own way. Just hearing loud noises, things of that nature. So that was basically, I think day 1 and day 2. Yesterday, things sort of calmed down a little bit, but now, of course, things have shifted somewhat. So I think for the first couple of days, we were told that, yes, there were missiles coming our way, but they were actually being intercepted, and that they were primarily, focused on the U.S. military base that's here in Doha, just south of Doha. Yesterday, we received word that actually, the airport was also targeted here, Hamid International Airport, as well as it's an attempt, basically. So they weren't successful, of course. The drones were shot down, but there were actual attacks yesterday that did make contact with different locations on the ground, Qatar energy resources, things like that. So Qatar, huge LNG producer. So of course that's had huge implications here. You've seen the markets reacting as you've alluded to earlier. So I guess there's a bit of a shift from U.S. assets more into local civilian assets here on the ground. So I think there's been a little bit of shock by that, and what happens from here remains to be seen. And of course, yesterday, as a result of the attacks on Qatari soil, essentially, the Qataris then took action, and actually they shot down some Iranian planes as well. So today is day 4. There were some very early morning strikes this morning. I actually slept through them. I didn't hear them because I've just had many nights of, kind of not so great sleep. So I didn't even hear it, but there were some strikes this morning that were intercepted as well, that were apparently very loud here in Doha. And it's been a relatively quiet day. We haven't really heard much today. It's been almost eerily quiet, really. So that's where we are right now. We do feel safe. We are following orders. People are at home. It kind of has a bit of a COVID vibe, you could say, in some ways, sheltering in place. But yeah, I mean, we're kind of here. There's also been some updates today from the ambassador, the Canadian ambassador here in Doha as well. So, and of course, the government of Canada has been communicating with us basically daily. But obviously the airport is closed, so there's no way out. Some people have been discussing maybe going through Saudi, but I don't think that's really a viable option, because Saudi is also, experiencing its own attacks and things now. So we're here. I really don't feel that there is a need to try to, evacuate, at least for the time being. So, and most expats like myself are feeling as though, that they're safe for the time being. So there are some, Bloomberg had an article that was discussing, there may be some potential shortages of missile interception technologies. The Qataris have been reassuring us that that's not the case. So
okay, well,
that's where we're now on day 4.
Well, I appreciate the update. Stay safe. Any message for the crowd in St. Brendan's before I let you go?
Yeah, obviously in constant communication with the crowd on St. Brendan's, right? Yeah. Hi, Mom. Yeah, we're all good here. We're a healthy dose of Newfoundland humor, I think, goes a long way.
There
right?
You go.
But yeah, we're good for now, and we're taking it in stride as I guess we always do, right?
Okay, I appreciate the update. Stay safe, obviously, and I'll be following you on Facebook with your other updates. So thanks, Allison.
Okay, thanks, Adam.
Cheers. Allison Furlong there, a Newfoundlander in Doha, Qatar. All right, so we heard from a local Iranian speaking about things, and then also a Newfoundlander abroad. When you're living through missile attacks, it's quite the thing. But at the same time, like Allison mentioned, you get tired, and sometimes you just sleep through the latest ones, which is also Quite the thought.
Living through a crisis in real time.
Yeah, because you got to eat, you got to sleep, you got to do all that stuff as stuff goes forward. Anything stick out for you guys, in these conversations?
Yeah. Oh,
you can rock, scissors, paper.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is something as well. We've talked about this before, and it's with other conflicts as well, and it's always good to bring up. Is there's often a naivety about the use of force and war, and the assumption that the whole idea of surgical strikes and so forth. But I think the important thing is both Justin and I study war in different ways, is that war and military force is an exceedingly blunt tool. Yeah. You can start wars when you like, but you can't end them how you like. Mm-hmm. And so you do have to kind of look at what's going on, what's the plan, and what does particularly the US, but also Israel, expect to happen from all of this. And certainly when looking at the US administration, it's not clear they have a plan. And we are getting some very strange noises from members of the Trump administration. There's always been a chaotic nature of the Trump administration. But it was sort of, they've been talking about nuclear weapons. They've been talking about a regime change. And there's even a weird one from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and we talked about this earlier, where he said we had to go in because the Israelis were already going to do it. So there was a kind of a preemptive, even sort of using the Israelis as an excuse for the bombing. Now, the real question is here, what is the Trump administration's plan? What are they going to do? They're now talking about 4 to 5 weeks of this. Mm. But, we kind of need to know what they're about. And this is where it's maybe different from earlier administrations and even earlier interventions, many of which of them failed as well, is that you always got a clearer plan and a clearer justification from the like of the Bushes or the Obamas. And we're not getting that with the US.
And all of a sudden you bring in like that old Donald Rumsfeld quote, there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Effective intelligence must work to consider them all. This is from another conflict, another generational conflict. But to dig through that quote, when you're looking at it, just stuff comes up that you're not going to be ready for because you can't be ready for all of it. Justin.
Well, I want to. I agree with everything that Luke said. Of course, I want to first thank Aysan for sharing her story, and I think we don't hear enough from people inside Iran who have suffered under that regime for 47 years since the Islamic Revolution of 1978, 1979, and I share her optimism and hope that Iran will be free of the regime one day. I hope it's Iranians that do it. I think only Iranians can ultimately do it, but I share her optimism for a better future. I want to address, and I think this is what Aysan was referring to, I want to address the notion of Israeli-American aggression here within maybe a bit of a longer historical context for a moment.
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here. That's why I'm the historian. I look backwards for you.
Yeah.
How should we characterize the Islamic regime's foreign and domestic policy over the last 47 years? Mm-hmm. If we're going to call the latest action American-Israeli aggression, and perhaps definitionally we should consider them the aggressor. Iran has not attacked this week the United States. But we do have a history of 47 years of a regime that has not only oppressed Iranians domestically, but a regime that has inarguably been the main destabilizing power polity in the region. A regime that has effectively since 1982, 1983 ruled as an imperial power in Lebanon and prevented that country from aligning itself economically or diplomatically with the West and more globally as well. A regime that has, for decades, killed not only American, but other allied and European forces in Iraq. A regime that has acted effectively as an imperial power in Yemen with the Houthis. A regime that supported and propped up not only directly the Assad regime in Syria, but indirectly by ordering Hezbollah to wage war on behalf of the Assad regime in Syria, a regime that has propped up Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who both have fundamentally since day one been opposed to a two-state solution in Israel. Say what you want about various Israeli governments, Hamas and Islamic Jihad have never had peace with Israel as their ultimate objective. So I don't think we can talk about American-Israeli aggression, and in the case of the Americans, we can go back to the Beirut embassy bombing, the barracks bombings in the 1980s, and other episodes that get kind of lost in the shuffle over 47 years of Iranian terror. I'm not kind of shy to say it.
Yeah.
And as Aaron David Miller, who I really respect and enjoy listening to, has referred to the now late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as the 86-year-old incarnation of evil.
Yeah.
What do we characterize that then as, if not 47 years of Iranian aggression on the world stage? A regime that has not allowed Iran to play a meaningful part in the international community, a regime that has isolated the country as opposed to integrating it, either economically, diplomatically, politically, whatever. A regime that has had dozens of off-ramps to stop its nuclear enrichment program, of which the International Atomic Energy Agency, neutral analysts have explained there is no civilian purpose for the degree to which Iran wants to enrich uranium. No non-nuclear state enriches uranium to the purity that Iran tries to do. So I understand the angle that, especially over the last 3 years, and going back perhaps even to 2001, 2003, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Americans obviously have a fraught history in the region. But if we're going to call that American-Israeli aggression and portray it as seemingly kind of coming out of nowhere, responding to a non-existent threat, what the hell do we call the last 47 years of the Islamic regime, if not also an aggressor that is finally being confronted? I know that's a strong position to take, but I think in light of, Aysan gave me some confidence to say it. I think in light of what we hear from Iranians in the diaspora, it's a very different story.
Well, I mean, I think this is why it's so important to have all these voices heard, right? You look at, you talk about what is the United Nations. You talk about what is this response. You listen to the Iranian diaspora. You look at the legality of it and what we want for the world. And you also talk about the deaths of, the schoolgirls and what, oftentimes gets called collateral damage.
Sure.
And then you say, what's the plan, right? You're going in here. You've done this. And you have some of the people leading it not great at planning.
Yeah.
So what's the follow-through?
And I think, on that, I think the point is both of these stories can be true.
Exactly.
And, this is the nature.
All of this is existing at the same time.
At the same time.
Yes.
This is the nature when you hit a crisis like this. And, that's why I think it's important that, both of us, all three of us are bringing in, and the guests are bringing in these different aspects, is that this is a multi-dimensional conflict. And each one is true, and each one is a part of the puzzle. And, I, again, agree with Justin about the nastiness of the regime in Iran.
History is important, right?
It
this
is
what,
very true.
And when I look at,
it's a history that animates comments like Aysan's and any Iranian from the diaspora you talk to. I mean, they don't speak ahistorically or without context.
This is why I always appreciate you guys coming in, because it's when you live in Newfoundland and Labrador, unless you're one of you, right, or you're really, really attuned to a certain part of the world for whatever reason, interest, or because of family connections or whatever else. It's so hard sometimes to kind of put all these things together and to try to kind of contextualize it and to think a little bit more about what's going on, which is why I find all the voices today for these types of shows so helpful, because now, does it boil anything down? No, it actually makes it more complicated, but that is also the point, that things are complex.
Yeah, they are. This is the whole point. And I think, the problem with a little bit of knowledge is it allows you to see the world in clear, broad, primary colors. And the point is that's not how global politics is like. We even go back to the discussions of the UN. You get sort of the knee-jerk reaction, why isn't the UN doing something? But, when you drill down to it, you understand this is actually a very complex situation. And of course, coming back to the point I think that both Heidi and you made, Justin, which is, the UN actually is all of us. We are members of the UN. So to talk about the UN disembodied like that. So, these are complex crises, which is why, we need the full hour of the Signal to talk about it.
Justin?
Well, complex crises, yes, and complex solutions as well.
Yes,
I mean, like we were talking
100%.
about earlier in the show, there is no clean off-ramp here for the Trump administration or the Netanyahu administration and anyone else who gets involved. There are reports that Germany might actually take an active participation in strikes moving forward. Something that was unprecedented. This kind of dovetails nicely with our talk with Heidi, who's in the region. Allison, who's in the region. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, for the first time in Saudi Arabia's history, authorized the Saudi armed forces to strike within Iran if the retaliatory strikes continue to hit Saudi Arabia. This has, if anything, pushed the Gulf states closer together in their opposition towards Iran and normalization and or diplomatic military alliances with the United States and normalization with Israel, because they too have realized that what the Iranian regime in Tehran promises, which was that we will not hit you, doesn't happen. We've seen Iran strike in civilian areas as well. And on the issue of the Manab strike, of course it's horrible, right? Any time civilians in these conflicts are killed, it is a tragedy, of course. But, and I don't mean to be too devil's advocate here, but what about this, again, the 7,000 Iranians, if not more, that were slaughtered in the streets over 2 days, January 8th, 9th this year, if not tens of thousands of Iranians? What about over the last 47 years, unquestionably the tens of thousands of Palestinians, Lebanese, Iraqis, Yemenis, and Syrians who have died either as part of Iran's proxy strategy, its so-called axis of resistance, or have been sucked into conflicts largely of the making of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and been killed, as you said, as collateral damage. I mean, what about those people? That is in no way, to be clear, to take away from the tragedy of a school being hit in the southern Iranian city of Manab, which is quite close to the Strait of Hormuz and that strategic area as well. But I'm not... I just don't want us to forget the historical context in which this regime has toyed with this region for 47 years and caused untold death and destruction from Lebanon to Iran to Iraq to Yemen to Syria to the Palestinian territories of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
And meanwhile, as we look with the last couple of minutes left, here's one analysis by Mike Crawley. Why Trump still needs to sell Iran war to U.S. voters. So as this all goes through, you've got Donald Trump who's got some popularity issues. Midterms are coming. Voting takes place. The world is continuing to talk. I think I saw something about Macron and nuclear weapons earlier in France. Like, stuff is happening. And unfortunately, loss tends to lead to more loss. Right? Like, I don't know. Like you said, it's going to get worse before it gets worse, to quote for the quote.
Well, almost certainly, because even if we follow the logic of, well, what actually topples the Islamic regime in Iran, and it's the ascendancy of some kind of opposition military force, I mean, that's worse, because now we're talking about fighting in the streets of Iran, and possibly civil war. A war in which, no one, I think, hopes for the dissolution of Iran, a state that is 40% made up of non-Persians, a combination of Arabs, Azeris, Kurds, Balochis, etc. It is a fragile state in some ways, but it's also a state unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, that has existed for hundreds of years as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, putting aside the kind of oppression of the Islamic regime's 47 years in power. It's not quite apples to apples to an Iraq or an Afghanistan, which were relatively new creations carved out of very different peoples who had a history kind of also not necessarily getting along.
Luke, 20 seconds, final word for you.
And I mean, Iran, I think, does have, in that sense, a different history and a longer history. But, the issue about how's this going in the States, which we didn't talk about. It's going down poorly with independents. That could have an effect on the midterms.
Yeah.
A negative effect, to be clear. Some of
negative
the talk
effect.
that this is just about midterm results. I mean, the opposite is entirely conceivable as well. Some Republicans have been outraged over this, and it is a base that Trump promised,
Yes,
to
right.
end foreign military invasions.
Here we are.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, that's we can pick up on that next time. Guys, thanks for this.
Thank you.
No worries.
All right, folks, that's it for today's show. Thoughts, the signal at cbc.ca. Tomorrow, different topic, live at the Briar. We're talking about curling. Don't miss the show. Cheers.